Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. This is the podcast where we help you challenge your mindset and discover where you are. Tired of stories about other people's success? We can help you change your life, determine your time freedom point, and join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ideal Investor Show, where we bring you great guests and where we talk about how to generate cash flow, how to actually generate passive income, and how to ultimately get to the time freedom point. And today we have Scott Jelinek with us, and he is very well aligned with what we do. So Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Axel. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that before we really dive into how you do it and what you're doing and how did you get to the point that there are all kinds of pictures and videos of people with little chicks on your website? Tell us, how did you get to where you are today?
Well, we don't have enough time for the whole process, but it's an ugly story. And I don't know exactly when you started, Axel, but I started buying in 1994. And back then there was non-qualifying assumptions. I don't know if you even remember those. That was where anybody was allowed to take over a bank mortgage. Back then, they did away with them in 1987 for FHA and 89 for VA, but I started in 94 taking over people's mortgages. It's a lot like Sub 2, only with the bank's blessing, right?
Right.
And I got into it and I started buying rentals, and I got to about 20 by 2001. And in 2001, it was the first signs of appreciation. Up until then, we had no appreciation. From like the late 80s to 2001. I was buying them for the same price they bought them for. Well, then when appreciation started, I started getting excited. I'm like, man, my $65,000 houses are now worth 120, 130. Right. And I started going to seminars and reading books and doing everything that, we all do, right? Trying to learn the business. And everybody told me the same thing that they tell you now, which is why I got into teaching. That was debt equity, right? I needed to pull out that equity and use that equity to buy more houses. And I did. And so I pulled out all that equity. I had about 20 houses and I parlayed them into 84 houses.
Right. And
then 2007 came and I know everybody always says it was 2008. And I'm like, well, my QuickBooks begs to argue with you. It was 2007. And 2007 came and I had 84 houses, huge success in the world's eyes, right? And all of a sudden, I also had 84 mortgages. And suddenly I had 30-40% of them stop paying. And I didn't lose everything. I had about $1 million in cash, which I spent fighting the good fight for a few years. And then I lost 55 of those houses to foreclosure. And it was devastating because literally I'm driving around an Escalade that says stop foreclosure on the side, right? That was my business. And so then I started watching, who was still doing well. Everybody went out of business and people went back to their day jobs and the stuff they did before the boom. But there were certain people who were crushing it. Yeah. And so I started, find out what did they do different? What's their deal? How come they're doing so well? And one of the things that I found consistently across the board was they all owned everything free and clear. And I'm like, well, that's great for you. I don't have any money. I can't buy the stuff free and clear. It sounds like a great in theory. Free and clear sounds great, but you got to have millions of dollars to do it. But simultaneously, prices started plummeting. Yeah. And so they were the best deals ever. But yet I was dead to banks, right? I had 55 foreclosures. So banks weren't going to finance me for 10 cents. So I was dead to banks. I'd had no cash, but the best deals ever were around. And so I started finding out about private money and how could I use private money to fund them. But like hard money lenders want to give you 6 months. Private money lenders don't want to give you 30 years either. Right. But these prices got into a price point that worked. So I started figuring them out. That's where we created the slow flip model. I started figuring out what's the shortest term I can finance it for, paying back my lender, not being negative cash flow, and get it paid off as quick as possible. And that's where we kind of came up with, we pay off our houses in 5 years. And so although I say I'm a free and clear guy and I love free and clear, it's not that I'm paying cash for them. I just buy on very short-term mortgages, and then we turn around and sell them on long-term mortgages. So we're not actually landlords. We buy them on 5-year mortgages, and then I sell them on 30-year mortgages. And I know that was a long answer to a short question.
Oh, no, that is very good because it's kind of, it builds a bridge into where we want to go. Before we actually cross that bridge and see a little bit more in depth what's on the other end, I would like to try to understand, and maybe a little bit on behalf of the audience, but also for my own sake, when you said, okay, you ultimately got to 84 properties. I always thought that these, whether it's 84 or a different number, that these properties were rented. Is that wrong?
They were all rented. And this is the challenge that I have. A lot of times when I talk to people, people say, oh, rents don't come down. And I'm like, guess what? When you have 10 vacancies, what do? I got them listed at $1,000 a month. They didn't rent. They're still sitting vacant. Okay, well, now I'll try this. Now I'll try this. And you do what you got to do till they're occupied. So yes, if you were around, I don't know if you were investing back in 07, but what happened was, at least in my market, I'm in the Virginia Beach area, there was good people that were with me for years. So they were all occupied. They were all rented. But my people, it wasn't just real estate that got crushed. It was the whole economy. And I had people that were with me for years, and they weren't like they were bad people or not screened properly or anything negative about them. The market got crushed. They lost their jobs. And so suddenly I had 30-40% of them not paying. So not only it wasn't vacant where I can refill it. They were in there. I still had to go through a process that could take me 6-8 weeks or more just to get it vacant, then get it rent ready again, and then put it on the market. And we were in a horrible market at the time. And again, it didn't last long. I mean, it lasted 09. I mean, really, things started picking up real nice.
Right, yeah.
I wish I was starting investing in 09 instead of I was still recuperating until about 11. But yeah, so they were all rented, except they weren't all paying. And that's
right,
where
I understand that. And I think that's an important lesson, because on the one hand, when I'm talking about or people ask me, why do you call yourselves ideal wealth growers? The ideal, and I know you're very familiar with this, is basically not just a good word because we like to invest in residential real estate, but it's also an abbreviation where the last letter is leverage, right? The L is for leverage. And I think part of, if I understand what you're describing, part of the lesson is there's nothing fundamentally wrong with leverage as long as it's within reason, right? Like when I say, right, for example, for a renovated property, straight out FHA or something like that, we look for close or at, or maybe even above the 1% rule. When you translate that over, it gets you to a mortgage that is about 40 to 50% if you have it fully escrowed with insurance and the mortgage itself and the property taxes, and most of the time, even the property management, right? Like, so somewhere in the 50% area, 50% of the rent is what I'm talking about, is going into covering all these costs. And then you have reserve and maybe some part of your property management, and then there's your cash flow. So if I hear correctly, what you're saying is if you keep tapping into the equity, getting closer and closer to 80, 90, maybe even almost 100% leveraged, and then you either have a temporary non-payment of rent, or tenants just say, hey, I can't do it anymore, I lost my job or whatever, then it really becomes tricky, because on 1 or 2, you could probably do it out of your own income or your own reserves. But when you have 30 that do that out of 80 or 90, then it really becomes an issue where you just don't have enough, or most people would never have enough reserves, right?
And simultaneously, the prices plummeted. And again, I talk about it in my head. It was yesterday. And somebody just recently said, Scott, that was 15 years ago. And I'm like, I literally talk about it all the time like it was yesterday, because it's so ingrained in my brain. And there's a good chance, and I hate to ever say this, that it'll never happen again. Like when I talk to people that do my old plan, and I'm always like, I hate it because I'm so fearful of it. But in the end, I'm like, they've been killing it. And it's been 15 years. So, I mean, it very likely will never happen again. But I feel like, well, I'm too old to start over. And so I play a safer program where I do leverage, but I do it for a short term, and I never refi. I'm not pulling any money out.
Yeah, and I very much agree with you, Scott. And in the sense, no party, or you could even go and limit it down to say no birthday party, is exactly going to be the same like the next one or the previous.
Right.
But when we look at, for example, when I look at today and compare to the time around 2010 or something like that, one thing that I can see as a similarity is that the market again has maneuvered itself into a situation which is completely different reasoning, completely different underlying situation. But since this ugly time that you mentioned about, and by the way, for the audience, there's a place that's called Ugly Scott. So the podcast that you have, Scott, is, if I'm not mistaken, called Ugly Scott. So it was an ugly time. And I think, and I don't want to make it sound like we are in an ugly time right now, but what is actually currently, in my opinion, happening is that between 2010 and 2020, way too few inventory has been built. for a country that is still growing in population, not just through immigration, but just inherently, we are one of the few places in the Western world that is actually still growing population. So you would think at least to replace or to basically cater for this population growth, and I think the numbers are somewhere around 500,000-600,000 units per year is what would have to be built just so that the new people that are joining the population and getting to the age where you would want to live in a house could find a place, right? So I think in that sense, what we're seeing now is high interest rates comparatively to like 2-3 years ago. Very few inventory being built in the last 10 years. People holding on to their properties that have 2.5%, 3.5% mortgage rates, interest rates on it. And so people are basically almost forced, for lack of a better term, to find something to rent if they want to go from an apartment into a single family or duplex or something like that. And I caution our clients to say, okay, let's not dial that screw of rent higher and higher and higher just because we can get it, and then get comfortable with that kind of a cash flow, because it is not a sustainable thing. To me, it's funny, right? Like when you go for a mortgage, you have to show that your loan to income ratio is definitely below 50%, probably today more closer to 40%. But nobody is saying you're paying 60% of your income or even more than in rent, and nobody actually challenges that, right? So there are similarities in the situation, and I think the real big similarity of the ugliness we will see starting pretty soon in the commercial real estate place. The same thing is, like the use cases, why somebody wanted to have an office building or stuff like that are just not there in the same extent anymore. So it will be in the news, and I'm always saying, luckily, it won't affect us because we're just not doing this kind of stuff.
Well, I'll tell you what about 20 and 21? If the government did not start paying people's rent and they made it like nobody was going to work and they made it so you can't evict and you can't, do anything. Now they paid, so really some people got hurt, but for the most part, nobody got hurt. As long as you weathered it for a few months and the government paid it. But what if that same scenario happened and they didn't pay? And the government said, no, you're on your own. You knew the risk when you got into it, and I'm like, wow, that would be an interesting turn of events to see what could happen.
Yeah, that's true. Although I have one thing that I like to say, and I'm not saying this to you, Scott, because I know that we are, like-minded and aligned in our thinking about this fundamentally. But one thing that I believe is kind of a sign of our times these days is that everywhere we look, we're basically being presented with data and then opined about the data in as negative a way as possible, right? Like even during the COVID times, yes, you're right that a lot of people were not supposed to go to work. But overall, if you say, okay, how many people really absolutely had no work and no income, we're talking maybe 10%. 90% in that general area of percentage had a job or had money, and not unemployment money necessarily, or unemployment money maybe, but not money in addition to what they would have been eligible in regular unemployment if they just had lost their job and it wouldn't have been COVID. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. It was a very dire situation, and people that didn't plan their stuff properly. And I have to say we had no problems. The people that we looked at to even get permission to live in our houses, in our properties, which were not overly leveraged, they paid because they either got back into their job or they had their unemployment money coming in. But the most important thing is that we didn't get the leverage to a point where our reserves wouldn't have helped us to cover at least 6 months or more, right? So I just want to put this as kind of like a foundation, because I think we said this before we started recording, kind of approach this whole thing based on lessons learned from a pretty conservative point of view by now. So now let's cross that bridge and talk a little bit about what is a slow flip and how do we actually get these shorter mortgages to not have to use a lot of our own money.
So we use no money. It's all private money. We don't use any banks at all. I have not used a bank since 2007. Since I got smacked around during the bust, I have never stepped foot in a bank. I go to a bank, obviously, for my deposits, but I have never borrowed money from a bank since 2007. Yeah. So we buy what's considered very low-end properties. What part of the world are you in, Axel?
Well, we are stationed in San Diego, but we are investing mainly in the Midwest and Florida, and like Ohio.
Yep. So Midwest is a big market where we do. Okay, great. So I ask because when I say these prices, sometimes people are like, it doesn't exist. You can't buy a house for these numbers. We buy in lower end areas. And everybody, conventional landlords, including yourself, most people, including myself prior to getting into slow flips, will not buy in these areas because they're the worst properties. They're the worst tenants. And this is it for your listening audience too, that does your plan. These are bad deals. They're not the deals you would want to buy as a conventional landlord. They're going to have the worst tenant. They're going to have the worst turnover. They're going to have the worst maintenance, the highest crime, everything about them. Everybody's like, those are the worst properties. And I agree if you're going to rent them. So what we do not rent. What we do is we get in the middle. There's a gap in the marketplace. And so we get in the middle and we'll buy these properties that are unwanted because they don't work for landlords and they don't work for rehabbers. So we'll buy them and typically we get them for $30,000 or less.
Okay.
And on a $30,000 mortgage, we pay out 12% interest to our hard money, our private lenders, and they're on a 60-month mortgage. So it's 5 years. The payment comes out to $667.33, and that's amortized. That's not a balloon. That's amortized. So it's a 60-month mortgage, and then it's paid off. We instantly turn around and sell them with what we call kind financing. It's long-term owner financing. So we turn around and sell them on a 30-year mortgage. So we get in the middle because the buyers who want them don't have the cash. The sellers who have them need the cash. So we get in the middle where we provide the seller with cash, and then we provide the buyer with financing. And then we'll turn around and sell them sometimes 69, 79, 89,000. But the payment will be about $875, which is the same amount that person would have been paying in rent, only now they get to buy the house. So they'll put $3,000 down or $5,000 down, and then it's $875 on a 30-year mortgage. We're paying $667, which we make no money for the first 5 years because you still have taxes and insurance. But then after 5 years, we own them free and clear. It's small money on each of them because, especially where you are, rents could be $3, $4, $5,000. Our average rents are $875, but I have 178 of them now, and I have. I don't know if 81 or 82 of them are free and clear. I have a 20 that are coming free and clear this November. And so the free and clear is where it's at. The first 5 years, we don't make any money, very little, marginally. I always tell my students, I say, just consider no money until it's paid off. And then once it hits the 61st payment, it's all ours. And so that's kind of my whole model is we're not really landlords. We're kind of just like the bank. We step in the middle where the seller needs cash, the buyer needs financing.
So can we take take one of the locations, maybe if you have any, like in Ohio, for example, that you do these kind of deals where we could or you could talk the audience and myself through a deal, how this actually looks like with real numbers?
Yeah, so I'm not in Ohio. Right now I invest in Virginia, in Illinois, Missouri, and Indiana. And there's a specific town that we buy a lot in Illinois called Cahokia. Right. And I never heard of them before. I bought my first 20 I bought out there. I never heard of it. And I've actually been out there and seen it since. And they're just shoebox ranches and they're real price. So we're not getting smoking deals. This is their price. You can buy them right off the MLS for $20,000, $25,000, $35,000. Decent houses that I'm like, you can't build this. How is this $30,000? Right. But instantly then, so we'll get it, we'll close on it. And then instantly we market it maybe at $59,000, $3,000 down and $875 a month. And so the natural question a person would ask, Axel, is, well, why would someone pay $59,000 if it's on the market for $30,000, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the answer is we sell the financing. The house comes with it because they can buy ours. They can't buy the one next door. Might be $30,000, but they can't buy that one because banks aren't loaning on those houses. They have to have the cash, and they don't. So we get in the middle. We give the seller their cash because we're using private lenders, and now we're giving our buyer the financing.
So let's say you had a house, like you said, that were actually somebody wants to sell it for $30,000. So you go to a hard money lender and say, okay, I get a 5-year loan for 12% for the whole amount, and you give it to the seller. So now you own the place for $30,000 and you pay whatever the monthly on that.
$667.33, right?
Yeah. Okay. So now what happens from there? You go, where do you make people aware of now I own this house that I want to actually make available?
Yep. We immediately list it. We do 3 different ways. We do signage in the neighborhood, and we use people because it's all out of state. So we use people out of the area. We do Facebook Marketplace, and we do Craigslist. And then we'll market as owner will finance, no credit check, $3,000 down, $875 a month. And then we tell them all the details of the house, what work it needs, because typically they need some work, and we get flooded. And people always wonder, they're like, well, there's so many houses, why would you get flooded? And it's because there's so many people that can't buy conventionally. They need us. So we may have one house available and 80 people who want it.
Yeah, just very quick. To me, I'm starting to think I might use different words to what you're describing, but it sounds a little bit like lease to own or rent to own.
It's like it, except that we do actual. So I used to do lease to own, and I stopped it. I lost a court case once, and the judge told me that you can't, as much as everyone teaches rent to own and lease to own, saying you can transfer all the repairs over to the person. The judge told me otherwise. He said, well, you can write it in your contract. That's fine. However, the law still says you're the landlord. It's a lease.
I get that part, but what I'm getting at, and maybe for our audience to say, okay, if there's somebody out there who says, I don't have $20,000 or $30,000 to buy this property, and for whatever reason, no bank wants to give me a normal mortgage, like a 30-year or even a 15-year, but more likely a 30-year mortgage for the lower payment, because my credit score or my income or my debt to loan ratio, or whatever the reason might be, but I can pay, like you were saying, $866 or $900 a month or so. And instead of doing that as rent, and if I'm saying something wrong, I want you to brutally correct me.
Right.
I could afford $800 or $900 rent, or I can get this deal from Scott and his team, and I'm literally basically owning the house now for $900 a month, and I didn't really have to pay more than, like, what did you say, $3,000 or something like that.
Yep. Usually it's $3,000 down in the Midwest. In my area, we get 5 to 8, but in Midwest, we get about 3,000.
But it's more likely that somebody can put even 5,000 on a credit card or something like that, or have maybe 5,000 than 20 or 30,000.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay. And the reason why I thought it sounds a little bit like lease to own is because I know, and I've been approached multiple times in those communities where people that have been renting, I'm very fortunate, both in our community as well as myself, we have tenants that have lived 4 and 5 years in the property. And every so often somebody says, is there maybe a way that I could ultimately own this property? Right. And so I've been thinking about how could this work, but if it were set up in a sense that way from the get-go, you can say, okay, you're basically transitioning with me over this period. And if I get it right, you're saying in 5 years, or when is the switch then?
So we don't switch. We start them off with a 30-year term from day one. When I started this, I used to do, it was a lease to own. And I said, if you paid on time for 3 years, then I would convert you over to a 30-year mortgage, because I didn't want to have to redo everybody if they didn't work out right away. But now we start everybody from day one on a 30-year. We do a full 30-year term from day one. The big difference with like a lease to own or a rent to own is they have to convert at some point to either pay you off. Like if you wanted to sell to one of your people, they would have to get a mortgage, unless you decided to owner finance them. But we start them off from day one with the owner financing.
Okay, so now we're at the point you bought it 30,000. You have the 5 year. You said you're basically monthly to the hard money lender. Now we have this person who says, okay, let's just make it easy and say I buy it for 60, right? Or the underlying number, let's say, is 60, and so they are able and showing and proving that they can pay 850 or something, whatever that comes out to be. How does this then look like from the structure? So for one, I would be curious, where do the 30-year mortgages come from? I'm sure you get asked that all the time. And then also, how do they become owners from the start?
So we do it in-house. We do it through an agreement for deed. Some states call it a land contract or a contract for deed. So they have the benefits and burdens of ownership, but the deed stays in our name until it's paid off. And so the way I explain it to people is I always say, when you buy from a bank, the deed goes in your name and then you pay for 30 years. When you buy from us, you pay for 30 years and then the deed goes in your name. It's the same end result.
The bank has a lien on the deed, right? So if you don't pay, then they can call it. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So you guys basically similarly, actually, you said you keep the deed.
We keep the deed, but they have a contract for deed leaned up against it.
Right. Okay. So they're like the bank in a sense.
We act exactly like a bank. We don't get calls for toilets or, landlord calls. Our only job is right now it's processing payments. The first of the month we process who paid, who didn't pay, and then we send out notices, and that's our job. But there's no actual management involved.
So let me just say, if somebody works for you, not works for you, works with you, or basically joins your team, you help them to get access to these private lenders that actually make the money available?
Yes, we actually have a national company now, which is something new. The hardest part of this business used to be finding the private money. That was the whole key. Is like without the private money, the whole thing doesn't exist. Because we have such a big track record now, we have a national company now who is funding our people, our same terms, $30,000 deals, 12%. In some areas, they go up to $50,000 because the numbers still work. On $50,000, the payment comes out to $1,112.22, and on those, they get on a low end $1,175 to $1,275. So on some markets, we'll do a higher dollar amount, but never usually more than 50. And so now we have a national lender who's funding our people, and their goal, they're building up to doing 50 deals per month within our group. And so that's been a game changer for the people in our group. My number one guy is just closing in on 100 now, 100 of them. He's only been with me. It's going to be 5 years in December. So, I mean, that's pretty impressive.
So we were at our deal, you got it for 30, you put it out for 60, you find somebody who says, I want to become the owner of this property. I am willing to pay 60,000 for this property. And I'm paying, what was the monthly amount? 8 something, right?
Our payment out is $667.33. Our incoming is typically about $875 in the Midwest anyway.
Right. So, and then they also, besides starting to make those payments, they also pay like 3,000 to 5,000 kind of as a down payment, correct?
As a down payment, correct.
Yeah. So now for somebody who says, okay, Scott, this so far sounds really good. I want to be one of your investors. So I'm understanding then the difference between what we paid and what they paid is basically $30,000 or somewhere in that ballpark. Do we get that? Who gets that? Where does that go?
So no, we don't get it. It's in the house. It's on paper. But the reality is the money is not in that 30,000. The money is in the 30-year mortgage. So at $875 for 360 payments, it comes out to $315,000. That's the money, not the 30,000. We end up with $315,000 in payments coming to us over the 30-year period. That's
so what
where
we're really, so what we're really developing, which is kind of
monthly cash flow
play on what we're all working for, at least in Ideal Wealth Core, we're all working for passive income. So if I remember the numbers right, it's something like $250 a month different, right? About.
In cash flow, well, actually, there's no. I try and teach my people $0 until the 61st payment. So, and the reason
are you using the difference for extra principal?
No, not extra principal, because it's amortized for 5 years. I just tell them to keep it in their bank account, because what I don't want to happen is I don't want somebody to have a turnover or an eviction or a non-payer and then have to come out of pocket. So I teach my people to leave the down payment, the $3,000 to $5,000, and leave any excess monthly in the bank account until the 61st payment, and then it's yours. People hate when I say this too. I always say, you don't deserve $1 until your house is free and clear. Now it's yours.
Yeah, but I think that is basically a great explanation for why we both said at the start, this is somewhat of a conservative approach, because in my head, if I'm looking at this, that means you get 3,000, let's just be super conservative, 3,000 when the contract is signed, 3,000 in each of the first 5 years, right? So that would be a 15,000 plus 3,000, you have 18,000 slowly accumulating $250 a month in the account sitting, assuming you have nothing else that draws on it, or the buyer leaves or anything like that. Perfect deal. And then the 30,000 that you borrowed from the hard money lender is paid back. You have 15,000 sitting in the bank account, and you can use that for more purchases or whatever. But you're also still getting for the next 25 years $250 or so thereabouts.
No, for the next 25 years, you're getting the $875 a month. That's where the
right. The 875
because the money starts on the 61st month.
Yeah. So that makes it actually nicer.
Yeah. I'll tell you some negative things, and this is good.
I was about to ask about that. What's the downside?
Well, I'll tell you a negative thing against what you do, not against what you do, but a negative thing against what we do based on what you do. You get appreciation on your houses. We don't. Right. We don't get the appreciation. We have appreciation built in the beginning, but if 20 years down the road that house is worth $200,000, well, we are only owed now $40,000 or whatever their balance is, and it's their house from day one. It's their house, so that's a negative. The other negative is, and again, you're building a portfolio actually yourself, right? Well, you love your houses, or most people that are conventional landlords, you love your houses to a point, and they're your house. You take care of it. You have pride in it. Well, our homes are not ours. They're just pieces of paper to us. Somebody else has the pride of the house. Somebody else is the one it's in their portfolio, because we sell to a lot of landlords as well. So it's someone else's deal. For us, it's just a piece of paper. So a lot of people don't like that. Another thing people don't like about doing slow flips, they're like, well, what if everybody buys? What if they actually pay me off? I'm going to lose my houses. And I'm like, you're right. You'll lose your house, but you're going to have a ton of cash. And you use that cash and buy, for every one that pays you off, go buy 2 more.
Yeah. I hear that, and that would be one of the answers, I believe. I mean, the secondary one would be to say, okay, you can also get other houses, if they're really only basically little pictures on a piece of paper. If the one gets sold and you get paid,
right,
then you just get another one. But I think there's one additional twist, and I want to point this out for our community. Tell me if I'm right on that one as well, Scott. And that is, we are always looking for the long term to reach something we call the time freedom point. And as we're accumulating properties with the L at the end of ideal with leverage, the initial idea is that it's going to take 30 years to pay them off, right? And we're used to my first purchase, and obviously that dates it how long ago it is, but was $79,900, right? And that place is probably worth like 130 or something like that by now. But I obviously, through the rent payments from the tenant, have paid it down. I think it's down now to like 59 or something like that. So if one or two of those Scott properties were to literally be paid off, I could also, as the third option, say, okay, I just pay off my own mortgage as well. Yep. Right? On my investment property, now I'm no longer getting the income from the property that I got through Scott, but I get the full income to the property long term that I had and that I want to keep until I can hand it over to my heirs, right? So I think at least if you and I were to do this together, I wouldn't see it as so much of a negative unless it happens like 3 months after the 5-year point. That would be right. What also needs to be kept in mind, in my opinion, and there is statistics supporting it. Even owners don't typically stay in the same place for much more than 7 to 10 years. Right.
That's exactly where I was going.
The expectation that they're getting a 30-year mortgage and that they really do 360 payments on that same property. They will probably over their lifetime make 400 payments or whatever, but not on that same property. So I think it would be a false expectation to say, okay, I get 360 or basically 300 payments of $250. It will be some time, but it will not be the whole, 300 months.
And that's exactly what I was about to say, is that often when they're ready to leave, because the average American, I think it moves every 5 to 7 years, and the numbers may have gone up based on what you just said, because I haven't looked in a while. But when they're ready to leave, they have the option of selling the property. They have the option of refining it if they wanted to. They also, I let my people, if they ever want to leave, they could either move into another one of my properties and we don't charge them a down payment, like if they have a growing family, or we let them turn them back in. And a lot of times they're just so thankful because they're like, oh, I thought I was going to have to keep it. I'm saying, no, as long as you're current, you can turn it in at any time. And now we start that 30 years all over again with our new person. So it's not like absolutely. The new person only has 21 years left. Now we're starting 30 all over again.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And I mean, I actually look at those kind of statistical things a little more often. One of the reasons why the term, the 5 to 7, has gotten a little longer is partially the appreciation. The typical transition to going from one property to the nicer or bigger, to the nicer and bigger, to the nicer and bigger has gotten so exponentially faster in expense. Like if I remember that the very first place that we gotten into was 120. 5 or 7 years later, we went into the next one in a different location, and it was 199, I think, right? About 5 years later. If you happen to be in the wrong time window, you could get a place for 150, and 3 to 5 years later, it's 300, right? And yes, that's nice because you have all that equity that you can then reapply for the next purchase. But the problem is still that people's ability to pay, because that is a matter of your income to the loan cost, right? Yeah. People have not increased their wages anywhere near as much as the price appreciated on the property. So yes, it might be nice that you now suddenly make $100,000 on the sale of the property, but when you then get into the next one, it's not that your cost is about the same, even though you make a higher down payment than you ever thought possible. It's typically significantly more, and it got even worse now in the last 16, 18 months, because now it's not just that you didn't increase in wages nearly as much as you would have had for the appreciation out there, but now the money has gotten so expensive, which is actually, in my opinion, the reason why the market is pretty much locked down right now from how it normally operates. Because everybody who looks at it and says, okay, I could get into the same house for twice the price, I'd rather stay where I am. Not even looking at anything better, bigger, right? So those two things together, the massive appreciation in the last, I'd say, 10 years, and now the massive increase in interest the last 2 years, is lengthening this turnover. How long does it take until people leave? But it's still not going to ever be 30 years, that's for sure.
Right, right.
This is really, really helpful because I am kind of sure people who are not necessarily in our program and listening to the podcast will be very interested to hear this. And I will definitely work with you after we're done recording to see if we can maybe get some of our people into your program. So if somebody were through me or by just listening or otherwise interested to get in touch and see how they can participate in what you are doing, how do they do that?
So I think the easiest way and the best way is, I don't know if I told you, Axel, I wrote a book called The Art of the Slow Flip, which basically goes through every step by step, what it is. And I love for people to read that first, because some people hate what we do and some people immediately love it. No, and it's okay. I always tell people there's a million ways to make $1 million. Choose one, right?
Oh,
You don't have to
I
do
know at
everything.
least 100,000 people who tell me the only way to invest is stocks.
Yeah. So I never say mine's the only way, right? But
Yeah, right.
certain people, when they see my way, they're like, that is what I want. I just want to have a few. I want to make 10 grand a month for 10 grand a month, you only need 20 houses, and in 5 years you get it. And so that's the best way, is to start with the book. And I think I told you already, Axel, I'm giving everybody, all your listeners, a free copy of the book if they just go to slowflip.com. That's SLOWFLIP.com, and just pay the shipping and handling. I have 250 of them printed and ready to go right now. I mean, it's on Amazon, it's everywhere, but if you want a free copy, just go to slowflip.com and I will send them out a free copy. And that's what I would like them to do first, is read it and see if it resonates with them, because they may read it and be like, I hate it. I want my houses for the rest of my life. And they may read it and be like, that's exactly what I want. Hands off. I don't want to be a landlord. I don't want management. I don't want any of that. And so I always tell people that the best place to start is read the book, go to slowflip.com. And then if it's something that resonates with you, then we can talk further about going to the next step.
Yeah, that's very good and very generous of you. Thank you so much for doing that. And we will definitely put the links and everything like that into the show notes. And maybe, I mean, I might follow up with you to see if we can do something through our newsletter as well, so that normally we wait until the show is published, but we can maybe put this into the newsletter so people can get the book already before the show comes out. So
Absolutely.
It's very good. Thank you again for your time and for explaining all of this and being generous with the book. So at the end of the podcast, I always ask the same two questions, and you're not going to get away without those either. So the first one is, Scott, if you could meet anybody, who would it be and why?
Well, I would say, and I know he's controversial right now, but I'm a fan of Elon Musk. I think I'd like to meet him. And I think the reason is, and I read a big book, Elon Musk's, it was his biography by Ashley Vance. It was a great book. But one of the things I really liked about him, what I value, I believe I would get, is his ability to think 1,000 times larger than I'm even capable of, or that most people are capable of. And so I really think, of all people, that's somebody that I would enjoy to meet, and I think I would get a lot of value out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you get that appointment, I definitely want to track along. One thing, actually, I might say for anybody who is intrigued by you saying that, I can highly recommend to look at the master plans that got published and read them in sequence, master plan part 1, part 2, and part 3. Because that gives, at least for our future, quite a bit of a big picture idea. And then for anybody, you can tell I'm a fan too, but
Okay.
What's his name? Isaacson, the guy that wrote the Steve Jobs autobiography, the biography that he wrote about Elon Musk comes out in September, and I've already pre-ordered it. That's probably going to be very enlightening. If we can't make the meeting, but we can at least get the book about it.
Have you read the other one I mentioned? It's by Ashley Vance.
I've pretty much read all of them.
Okay, I thought that was a fantastic book, and you really got inside his thinking, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's just, I very much agree, Scott. The only thing is, it's kind of getting a little dated late from today's perspective, because when you look at when that got published and all the things that had happened since then, I'm really, really curious what Isaacson is writing about. And I hope he's not going to go all the way from, when Elon was born, but more like, okay, here are the books that have been written up until like 2012 or so. Now let's look at the last 15 years and see what has evolved. That would be cool. Anyway, so you and I, we maybe, if we try both, maybe we have better chance. The other question, the very last question, is, if you had a time machine, not allowed to change the space-time continuum, but you could go anywhere you wanted to, where would you go and why?
Well, this has nothing to do with business, real estate, anything. No, totally. But I would probably a 50s guy. I've always loved the 50s. And so I probably would be in that time. I always felt like that's a time period that I think I was meant for. I think I would have loved that. So I would probably say the 50s.
Oh, okay, very cool. You're doing like James Dean or something like that?
Yeah, that type of life. Yeah.
Okay. Don't crash when you're there. All right, Scott. Very, very, very good. So I want to thank you again for the time. I want to thank you for your generosity. And I'm making sure that everybody can learn about how to slow flip and become an owner. Like you said, being a bank in the middle is kind of a wonderful slogan in addition to what we do. So be well and stay safe, and I hope we can do it again.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.